Hello, everyone. My name is Caleb Wimmer, and today I will be doing my screencast on Umana Taylor's piece on ethnic and racial identity, and in particular, the development that occurs between adolescent and young adulthood. So, obviously, first and foremost, the main question is what exactly is ethnic and racial identity, and how is it used in the article? So, it's often abbreviated as ERI in the article, and what Umana Taylor means by it is more so the attitude an individual holds towards their combined racial and ethnic group membership, as well as the processes that create these beliefs over time. Um, so that will include both the racialized experiences due to the different categories such as black that people are ascribed to in societies, and also the connection and experiences that individuals have based on their particular cultural or ethnic ancestry. So obviously, as you can see here, and one of the main questions here is why exactly she combines ethnicity and race into the same category, and that's because the argument that she uses is that even though obviously there are different entities with that serve different purposes, um, for the purposes of like studying the cognitive development and how it affects like the identity formed by an individual, they do have quite a bit of similarity in their like in the constructs and how they are perceived. So that's why they're sort of mushed together into this single category. And another key point that she it really hits home on in the article is focusing on the idea of content versus process, um, meaning that the ERE is composed of those two things, where the content is more so like what exactly is being said about it, what exactly someone identifies with, and the process is sort of the development or the stages that someone goes through to actually reach the content. And we'll see a little more clear version of that in the next slide. Um, so this next slide is like the only graphic, or I guess it's sort of a graphic, but in the article itself, which is on the ethnic and racial identity development through the particular cognitive milestones. Um, and so obviously it's split up into these different categories. And if you notice, there are a lot of similar concepts that to what we discussed and read in the Steinberg pieces, such as the ones on cognitive development and social developments. Um, and these categories should be familiar to us then, starting with early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, and young adult slash emerging adulthood, and these particular cognitive milestones. Um, but in particular, the emphasis for this article is more so on the corresponding ERE components, which you can see are split up into both process and content. Again, process being the manner of which someone goes through and thinks about and is aware of their ethnic and racial identity, and the content being um, what exactly is thought, right? The process is how they think about it. The content is what exactly is the thing. So if you want to, you can pause here and continue to look at this, but otherwise we'll move on to the next slide, discussing early to late adolescence. So the reason why we start here and not on childhood or pre-adolescence is because that is spent more on the identification and categorization of ethnic and racial labels, right? Like determining what is this is this race, this is that ethnicity, um, because of the limited cognitive abilities at that early of an age. Whereas as you grow older and reach adolescence, that's when you have the growing social cognitive maturity during puberty, obviously, which allows for the processes of ERI to actually begin fully. Um, so or also the cognitive abilities in adolescence sort of the allows those adolescents to merge their personal identity with the groups that they already began to identify earlier on in their pre-adolescent stage. Um, so some key components of this adolescent development in ERA is sort of the exploration or search, where you seek out or expose to information on their ethnic racial group. This can come from a variety of means, and it is also, which we'll discuss later on in like the social environmental context, um, but it's also tied a lot to general cognitive development, like we read in Steinberg about um, general quest for knowledge and like tied to like who am I questions that rise during childhood and those sort of thinking patterns. Um, and then I'm not going to get too in depth of it, but there are like the different four different identity statuses: achievement, uh, moratorium, foreclosure, and diffusion, which is it's kind of a complicated theory, but it involves like how exactly one solidifies their identity and through these different phases. But for our intents and purposes, it is related to the exploration and searching about how one develops their identity. Um, so, what exactly are these developments that occur during adolescence? Obviously, something like increased autonomy is something that we all know happens during adolescence. Any sort of move towards independence, such as obtaining a driver's license, getting a job, constructing your own peer groups that aren't supervised or maintained by your parents. Um, but basically, any move that shows a move towards independence thought away from simply just accepting what your family tells you. Um, and because of this, the knowledge about feelings towards ERE or ERI are what change in this. And two particular terms that are used that I think are important for us to know. One is salience, which is the extent to which one's ethnicity race is relevant to one's self-concept in a particular situation, which is determined by the relation between the context of the situation and the individual's tendency to define themselves in terms of ethnicity race. So, to put that more simply, salience is more so how often and in what ways one decides to identify themselves or to not identify themselves with their particular ethnicity race. And then there's also public regard, which refers to the extent of which use, or I guess that people in general, feel that others, whether that be individuals, groups, and broader society, view their particular ethnic racial group in a positive or negative light. So again, that's more so. It's not like like a general survey of like everyone in the society, but it's more so the perspective of that one individual on how they think that society views the ethnic group. So, next, discussing the effects of stereotypes on adolescence, which I found this part in particular was fairly interesting. So adolescents with greater salience and identification were found to be more likely to adopt or confirm the stereotypes surrounding the ethnic or racial group of which they identify to. Um, and here's the little excerpt that I included here from the piece, which is actually citing a different study. But in middle school, when academic tracking becomes more prominent, Latino adolescents may begin noticing that Latinos are being segregated into lower achieving tracks. This awareness may result in poor academic adjustments among Latino adolescents who had relatively more positive feelings about their ethnicity. But differently, youth who feel a stronger connection with a stereotype group may begin to underperform, consistent with the stereotype about their group. And you can look into the article to see like the more specifics and like the actual study that is being referenced there. Um, but I just thought, well, and we'll discuss more about like the need for individual distinction versus the need to feel in a group, and how that relates to the what kind of school and like what kind of peers someone interacts with. But I just thought it was interesting that because of the salience and like the greater connection to a group, it can cause that to conform. And obviously, this would be a negative example, but also it does have it in positive ways. Um, so this internalization, such so like the model minority stereotype, which is perpetuated and given to Asian Americans, is another way that this is applied, where because of the idea that they have, they're hard, they're harder working and they have the ability for higher um, social mobility, that actually does sort of come to pass, and they conform to that stereotype. So, um, and lastly, for the adolescent discussion here, is the idea of identity self-denial, where there is an attempt to hide or minimize one's ethnic racial background, including being afraid to express feelings about the in-group, which is sort of in a sort of like the reverse of salience, where you're less likely to be interested in identifying with your particular ERI. So moving on, we now come to young adulthood. Um, so before discussing young adulthood, there was a distinction that Umana Taylor made that there may be some bias in the sample demographics of studies relating to young adulthood, because generally speaking, they're taken on college campuses, and not the larger adult population, which obviously can have some sort of reflection in like the demographics of the studies, because college can is seen as like a consciousness raising experience, which would create different thought patterns and identities than one would experience just in someone that did not attend college. So that's just something to bear in mind with this if you were to look in the studies. Um, but overall, probably what is most characteristic of the shift from adolescence to adulthood is the complexity in this developmental period, where ERI, sorry, is no longer considered in isolation by itself, but more so how it interacts with other identities that have been formed, such as political, gender, national, social class, career, etc., and how that person decides to identify with said identities. Um, so the construction of elaborate narratives that help make sense of complex identities, that is sort of something that obviously cannot occur in childhood, and also not so much in adolescence, but into adulthood when the mind is still finishing off its development, and you're getting more and more complex narratives and thoughts. Um, and so this will actually also cause individuals to become increasingly more rigid in their views as their identities solidify. So the reason why these narratives, so to rephrase that, um, young adults, or as you go further and further into adulthood, um, narratives are constructed to make sense of the complex identities and the different ways people associate with others and they see themselves. And because of these narratives, they can become more rigid in their views and more, more set in their ways, because that's sort of like a side effect of that way of thinking. Um, However, to go against that would be the idea of adult identity transformations or dramatic ERI related attitude changes, which is sort of like an epiphany where they can um, something like that happens and drastically change identities even into like advanced ages. Um, so the implications of ERI in the adult context, which I also thought was interesting, where the discussion was about how psychological integrity, which includes concepts such as self-esteem, ego strength, and general personality strength, for ethnic racial minority group members for whom race, ethnicity, and culture are important. So, someone who has a higher salience, um, it's so that psychological integrity is actually more or less the same as those who do not have that salience, who don't have that cultural identity or ethnic racial identity importance, who are more seen in more assimilationist frameworks. Um, but what is stronger in those who do hold more positive feelings towards their ERI, is more attachment to their cultural group, greater cultural involvement and participation in said group, and sort of the connection where instead of an individualist standpoint where you're more concerned about um, your own well-being, it's and like just greater society, in particular those with high salience in their ERI are more involved with your particular communities. So the last major discussion will be on the social and environmental context of these discussions. Um, so obviously, individuals themselves are embedded into many different social contexts, such as family, peers, community, local, national, etc. And while the article does mention a lot of Erickson, I thought this one in particular was good to note about how um, it's supportive of the idea that identities emerge and develop as consequences of these interactions between individuals and their social context. So, um, the developments that we talked about before, obviously, they have a big impact on identity development. However, at the end of the day, it really is dependent on the environmental, social factors and needs of that person. So, to discuss some of these different environments, obviously, family is one of the most important of the proximal social contexts, um, and because of it being instrumental in teaching values and behaviors, and that close and warm relationships with parents are generally associated with more well-developed um, ERI components. So those who have a closer connection with their families are more likely to have um, positive affections towards their identity that way. Um, Again, another thing, peers can also have massive influences, um, and use ethnic identity can vary pretty drastically based on whether they're engaging in same ethnicity or different ethnicity peers, which we'll see more of on the next page. Um, about how positive feelings about ethnicity when interacting with same ethnicity inside a majority school, but no connection in minority dominant schools. Um, so what that means is that uh, so what that means is that um, because of the need for individuals to have both de-individualization, which of feeling connected to something, like feeling the need to be part of a group, and distinctiveness, it can actually change the significance depending on who or what the situation is. So, for example, the article mentioned how minority students, if they're in like a majority white school, they're more likely to have positive feelings towards their ERI because of the association with their peers. But if sort of like joining together, so, but if it's a situation where it's actually a minority dominant school, they're less likely to focus on those um, de-individualized elements and more so want to focus on more distinctive elements, um, which would have them have less positive feelings towards their ERI, which I thought was an interesting um, analysis. Also, ethnic and racial signifiers are adopted or not based on how relevant they are to the experiences of the person. Um, so obviously, this is not surprising that social identities relevant to ethnic race are especially central for ethnic and racial minority individuals being members of a seemingly permanent outgroup. So here, um, the idea of like de-individualization and distinctiveness is not something that is solely based on, race and ethnicity in identity, but for those that it doesn't necessarily impact, like those of part of a majority demographic, can do that in other ways, such as common interests, hobbies, sports, where they have those sorts of mechanisms to feel distinct and also de-individualized, um, whereas they don't really need to focus so much on the ethnic and racial identifiers. And the last component here is that migration history also plays a role in ERI development, with those who immigrate at a younger age have less of a need to identify with ERI than those who immigrate later on. Um, Obviously, because there's less lived experiences in those that are younger, whereas those that are older have obviously lived for a certain time in a different country and have had experiences and developed to some degree. So they have a harder time adjusting, and obviously have stronger memories of what life was like before immigrating. Whereas those that are younger and those who are born in the United States are less likely to have those same feelings. Um, and overall, this is just illustrative of like the many different experiences in different groups within larger like ethnic and racial groups. Um, which obviously, if you were to, I think the examples they mentioned was like just the category like Hispanic would include, you know, Mexican Americans, those from the Dominican Republic, Italian, and those with Italian ancestries in Argentina. So it's a wide variety of different ethnic and cultural groups that are sort of mushed together. And it was important to note that, obviously you can't just connect them all to one thing, and that you should see them in a different light. Um, so overall, here I just offered a little quick summary of the ERI developmental timeline, um, starting with childhood, which is more ethnic categorization, knowledge, and behaviors. Adolescence, which is effective cognitive and explorative processes, development of the personal meaning. And young adulthood, which is the expansion of ERI into relevant life domains and the increase in complexity. So overall, I thought it was a very interesting article. It was a little dense at times and like a little hard to get into, but like after studying it several times and beginning to learn the intricacies, it definitely made a lot more sense, and I could see the connections to our practice as teachers and also to the readings we've done before, and I assume that we'll continue to do on. So that is all. Here is my citations, and that is that. I hope you all have a good day.